Hello all. My name is Iryna Izarova, and I'm honored to serve as the chair of the Ukrainian regional chapter of the European Association of Science Editors. It's a pleasure for me to welcome you all to today's webinar on CRediT, the Contributor Role Taxonomy. As passionate advocates for the dissemination of valuable tools in academic publishing, we all believe that understanding the creation and implementation of this taxonomy is crucial. Clear authorship, attribution, and recognition are vital components of the academic publishing process, and this taxonomy offers a structured approach to defining contributor roles. In today's webinar, we aim to explore the importance of clear authorship, the practical implementation of CRediT in academic publishing, and its potential benefits for researchers and publishers. I'm excited to see such a diverse group of participants and speakers and look forward to the meaningful discussion and collaboration that will ensue. Thank you very much, all of you, for joining us today, and let's get started. I want to put some questions to the audience in our chat and encourage our audience to use the chat for putting questions to our speakers. And I would like also to announce that the webinar will be recorded. Mary will do this for us. Our first speaker is Simon Kerridge. I'm delighted to have Simon here, an independent research consultant and managing editor of the Journal of Research Management and Administration. Simon brings over 25 years of extensive experience in research management and administration. His contributions to the field, including leading research support at two UK universities and serving key roles in various associations, make him a highly respected figure in the academic community. Simon's current projects, such as research administration as a professional surveys and CRediT Taxonomy, highlights his dedication to advancing research practices globally. Simon, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Iryna. Thank you for having me. I will see if I can take my allotted time and not too much more, and hopefully no less. And if I do my screen share, then there we go. Okay, great. So welcome everybody. I've got about 20 minutes. I'll see if I can do it in 18 and a half minutes. Thank you very much for the introduction, Iryna. You've mentioned quite a few of my affiliations there, so I'm not going to bother going through them all. What I will do is go to my next slide. Some of you may think that that is Daniel Craig. Actually, that is what I see when I look in the mirror. So just to be clear about my view of myself, that's what I'd look like pre-COVID, before I sort of gave up shaving, and that is apparently what my wife sees in the morning, but yeah, never mind. And I just have to have a quick plug for my book. If anyone's interested in research management and administration, then do look at the lovely book. It's open access, so it's all free. And yes, if anybody is interested in any of those, about 1,000 acronyms, I can talk through any of those, but of course I shall be focusing on this lovely little CRT one, the CRediT one today. So this slide is probably all I need to say, but I have got plenty more, don't worry, or do worry, depending on how much you like the sound of my voice. So you'll hear this a lot today. The Contributor Role Taxonomy is 14 roles. A role is an interesting way of describing it, but we'll delve into that in a bit more detail. It was actually developed 10 years ago. I'll give a little bit of history, and was finally formally adopted as a standard by NISO and therefore by ANSI, and it's Z39-104-2022 for those interested. You can look it up. So it was formally adopted just over 2 years ago now, and we are seeing sort of accelerated uptake because of that. And you're going to hear about a couple of users, one from before and one after. So yes, 2020, 2012, in fact, could be more than 10 years ago. Don't know why I had 2014 in my mind, never mind. A group got together for a workshop at Harvard, and the International Committee on Medical Journal Editors were sort of trying to address this problem, which you're going to hear a little bit more about, I'm sure, during the next presentation from Dan, about, well, how do we describe the roles that authors have taken, what sort of constitutes authorship, although CRediT isn't directly involved in that, but what information can be made, shall we say, more programmatically, if you like, or in a more structured way. One of the main points behind the development CRediT was that it would be practical, easy to understand, and minimize the potential for misuse. Having said that, there of course are always some little minor issues. Why? Well, multiple authorship is on the rise. Sorry about the resolution of this. These are various of the PLOS journals, and you can hopefully see that over time, going standard sort of left to right, the average number of authors per publication. Not that much in PLOS one, the green one in the middle, but in most of the other areas has been sort of rising, probably 50, 60, 70% extra. And so what is it all these authors are doing? If you need to know who did the statistics, how do you find out who that was, as an example? So yes, these are the challenges, if you like. The authorship doesn't, as I say, reflect the range and nature of contribution, and doesn't support accountability. I've just shown the slide about the sort of demise of the lone author, particularly in the sciences, and it should be said that CRediT has been developed from the biomedical side of things, has had a large uptake in the sciences, less so in the arts and humanities. Probably to do with nomenclature, but we can talk about that as well. There has also been demand for additional information to support research assessment. So in certain countries, there are national research assessment exercises. I come from the UK, so I can tell you that it's very strong here in the UK. And so having something against your name is really important. But what did that contribution actually mean if you are one of the 1,000 or so authors on the Higgs boson discovery paper? Of course, we don't have space limitations anymore because most things don't have a single sort of print run. Everything's available online, so we can actually add in additional information. And yes, actually, what the authors actually did is a useful thing to know for various things, particularly if you are perhaps hiring or looking for a peer reviewer for something. Again, just examples. So here are the 14 roles. I'm going to more or less skip straight over this slide to the one which is a bit more useful, which is a bit smaller, but hopefully you can still see it, which gives some additional information about what those roles mean. The specific CRediT definitions are slightly shorter than these. These are ones that have been expanded by the developmental biologists group, and so they perhaps give it a little bit more of a flavor. Again, I'll mention something else on these definitions later. So I'm not going to read through them all, but it's pretty obvious, I think, what they mean. So conceptualization, who came up with the ideas, who formulated the evolution of the overarching research, the goals and the aims and so on. Perhaps the ones which are sort of more interesting because they're a little bit different are things like resources here. So who was responsible in the research for making sure that all the materials were available or perhaps put together, or use of computing. So things which on their own would not represent sufficient most journals to be an author, but might be something that one of the authors has been involved in. So you would have 2 or 3 or 5 or 7, never probably 14 of these roles, but I'm sure it's possible. So that's another thing that's worth saying. An author would have multiple possible roles. The averages depend on the subject areas, but probably between about 5 and 7 roles is about average. And I think Dan's got some information on that. Not part of the official standard, but a number of journals have taken up this sort of additional degree of contribution, where as well as saying that you were responsible for, let's say, conceptualization, did you take a lead role, or was it an equal role, or was it a supporting role? And so this sort of gives an additional layer of complexity. As I say, not part of the official standard, but some journals taken up and have found it to be useful. An important point here is this shared responsibility. While the corresponding author is going to be the one providing the information to the journal, just like everything else, part of what they should be signing up to is having made sure that they have agreed that all of the authors are happy with all of the roles which they are being given attribution for. So hopefully that's straightforward and will resolve any potential future issues in an ideal world. So just some examples. PLOS was one of the first journals, journal groups to take it up. So here's what an article looks like on PLOS. You can see the list of authors here, and this is just the first author. If you kind of then click on that, it will then bring up the roles, and you will see conceptualization, writing original draft, the things you remember from those 14 roles. So again, this person has done 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 of those potential 14 roles. So this is just part of the additional metadata which is brought up, email address, affiliation, and ORCID, and so on. A different author there has different roles. So this author only undertook 4 roles. Slightly worryingly here, as an author, they weren't involved in the writing, reviewing, and editing, which I think most journals would have wanted them to do to be an author. So that's an interesting point, which we'll perhaps discuss there later, but you can see the different roles associated for that person. Just a different way of showing that information. It can all be pulled out at the same time. It's just a different way of representing it. Another example here from the Welcome Open research platform. So again, you can see the authors listed out with their roles next to each other again. So it just depends. There's no formal standard way of doing it. It's just part of the metadata. You can represent it any way that you wish, that you feel is appropriate. So we have a long list, well, hopefully going to soon to be longer, list of early adopters. The American Association for Cancer Research, as well as being alphabetically first, was one of the first as well. We're going to hear from Dan on that. I've also highlighted Scholastica, who kind of joined up last year, and we're also going to hear later on as well. There are a number of publishing outlets as well as specific journals or publishers. So there are those kind of meta providers, if you like. There's been plenty about credit in the news. I'm not going to try and pick out anything in particular here, other than to say that we did receive a little bit of funding from the Sloan Foundation and the Wellcome Trust to help sort of promote and develop. So I'm here because of their funding, but of course I would have done it anyway if Iryna had asked me, so that's fine. And we are due to sort of give a final report at the end of this year to kind of show the uptake over that. So please do start using it before the end of the year. That would be great, and then it will help my final report. We've also recently written a paper about what we intend to do with credit in the future. Perhaps take a look at this. We've used some of that funding from Sloan and Wellcome to work with Mohammed Hosseini, who is working with a group, an advisory group, to develop some little videos, so sort of infographic videos of, if you undertook this role, what would it mean, and some information sheets. So very much expanding on those sort of 14 short definitions I showed from the development biologists before. Hopefully those will also be ready by the end of the year as well, and hopefully they'll be very useful tools, and of course all available and linkable to all open source, of course. There was a nice piece in Nature about 3 years ago talking about the effect on researchers and how things in terms of credit can make a sort of a more of a level playing field, helping to sort of enable them to be part of or enable them to be more visible. Having said that, Nature don't actually specifically say that you must use credit themselves, but hopefully they'll be getting there. And I won't talk too much about the Scholastica one, but there was a very nice press release which they did last year about the sort of why they've decided to move, and hopefully we'll hear a little bit about that. So what are we doing with CRediT now? Well, as I said, hopefully it makes clear the author's contributions. Many journals allow for credit and some mandated, so that's another option. If you're using a platform which allows for the collection of that metadata, then as a journal, you can mandate it or make it optional. If you don't wish to, or your platform doesn't support it, it's not as good. But what you can do is just allow authors to add in that as text rather than metadata, which is better than nothing, only just better than nothing. So only just an example of a paper I did in a journal which did not support credit, but as an author, of course, I wanted to show that, and so we just put those credit roles in, and because we've used those exact wording, then that should be easily scrapable in the future. So yeah, the idea is it supports collaboration. You can better find out the people you want to collaborate with out of a list of 7 or 8 authors, and hopefully useful for trying to find peer reviewers if you're a journal editor, something that is always problematic, or at least in my experience. So this is something we might want to talk about, sort of the publication ethics, and as I say, credit is not specifically tied to a definition of authorship, but it could be useful in having those discussions with potential authors as to whether or not they should be included or should not be included. And also, once those roles have been agreed, then hopefully that will obviate any issues in terms of author dispute later on. And I know that's something that is close to Iryna's heart. What might we be doing in the future? I've got the big cross-reference there. At the moment, credit metadata is not passed through Crossref, so that's a little bit of a blockage in the system. It is on their development list, but as and when it is, then that means that information can, for example, pass through into an ORCID profile. ORCID supports credit, and many journals support credit, but that information isn't automatically pulled through at the moment. So there's a bit of an issue. But the more people who start using credit, the more pressure Crossref will be under to do it sooner rather than later. I've talked about reviewers. And I've talked about potentially looking for finding future collaborators if you're a researcher. You could actually potentially use credit for reviewers and potentially credit for acknowledgements. So there are all sorts of potential extended uses, and those are things which we are working on as part of our sort of NISO advisory group. Where should we be putting our efforts our efforts next? So yes, there is a community credit interest group, SIG, which is a bit unfortunate because that's sort of short for cigarette in English, but never mind. And feel free to join up to that and perhaps get involved. That's kind of, I think, where I wanted to be. That's more or less all of my time. Do drop me an email or ask me any questions, but don't save any questions now until after we've heard from everyone else. So Iryna, I think that's me, and we can move on.
Thank you very much. It was extremely interesting, and actually I was going to ask you about future, and I was excited to get to know a little bit on within your presentation. But then after all this presentations, we will have some 10 minutes of questions and answers. And I kindly ask all of you to share the presentations with our colleagues because it's very interesting. So exciting to know that this is a year actually of anniversary of the taxonomy. Am I right?
Well, yes, I did say it was a 10-year anniversary. That's because I misremembered it as being 2014. It was actually 2012. So it is the anniversary. It's the 12th anniversary, but also the 2nd year anniversary of it being an ISO ANSI standard.
Really. Thank you very much once again. And I want to give this floor to Daniel Ivanko. Daniel is Senior Director of Journal Operation and System at the American Association of Cancer Research. With a background in leading editorial services for prestigious natural journals, Daniel brings a wealth of experience in improving editorial service and implementing innovative solutions like CRediT Taxonomy. And please, the floor is yours.
Hey, thank you very much for the introduction, Iryna. It's a pleasure to be here today and to talk about credit. Yeah, so the AACR journals have been using, let me just see if I can get the screenshot. Is this showing the correct screen? Yes, okay. I've got 3 monitors going, so it's a little confusing on this end, but as long as everybody's seeing the right thing, that's good to go. So I've been at the AACR journals where I manage the processes for publishing 10 of our journals in the area of cancer research, focused on author services, and editorial operations from the time that authors submit their manuscript to the time it's finally accepted and exported for publication in the journal. Okay, there we go. Okay. So before 2020, the AACR journals had a process where they had 7 custom standardized contribution categories that they asked authors to self-select for themselves using an e-form when the paper is ready to be accepted. And so each co-author would select what their contributions were on that form, and you can see a list of those there. And this is different than what many other journals do. I think probably most people are familiar with the fact that most journals allow authors or require authors to state what their contributions are, but these are just free-form comments in a paragraph, generally at the end of the manuscript, where the authors describe what each of the authors did. And this is useful in terms of the flexibility it provides, but it makes it difficult to interpret those contributions sometimes because people just talk about them the way they want to. There's no standardized taxonomy. And that also makes it difficult for them to be machine readable. So the AACR journals were a step beyond that in requiring a taxonomy, but it wasn't a particularly good one. It wasn't a standard taxonomy in terms of operational procedure. It was only when the corresponding author received the article proofs did they see that the contributions, what the contributions were that each co-author had selected for themselves. So oftentimes there would be disagreements about the contributions at that point because the corresponding author would determine that the co-author hadn't done what they were claiming to do. And we would have numerous instances of author disagreements about the contributions at that late stage in the process. So, so we decided that we wanted to use something different to help resolve that. And we saw that CRediT was a good, an upcoming emerging standard. That's now a formal NISO standard, as mentioned by Simon. The taxonomy was much more granular than the custom taxonomy we were using. And the manuscript submission system we were using already supported it. So that looked like a good choice in terms of how to move forward and improve the process of assigning credit in our published papers. And as Simon already mentioned, CRediT contains 14 standard categories, which you can see here. And we also have one free-form category, which the corresponding author can just put whatever they want into that category. So the way this process works is that when the corresponding author is submitting the manuscript on behalf of all the authors, they have to enter all the authors, all their co-author information, name, email, address, and they also have to indicate what that person's contributions were. And here there's a screenshot where you can see what the corresponding author sees when they're selecting those contributions. So it's so they see the full list. There's a link to the left out to the CRediT Taxonomy so they can see the definitions of each of those terms in case they're not clear. And so they then, for each of their co-authors, they'll just select the contributions that, in their opinion, are appropriate if they haven't previously discussed this with their co-authors, which unfortunately is more cases than not. But as Simon was talking earlier, ideally, authors should discuss this before they do the submission at all and even start submitting anywhere. But in this case, the way we've designed it, it does still work and help resolve conflicts because first of all, it's optional at initial submission. So the corresponding author doesn't have to make those selections at initial submission if they weren't aware that the AACR journals require credit. So they can just pass that step by at initial submission if they haven't discussed that with their co-authors and they don't want to preemptively determine what each of the co-authors had done. So we provide that option there. However, it is required at the first revision. So, at that point, there's a high likelihood of the manuscript being eventually accepted. So there's a good rationale for the corresponding author and the co-authors to get involved in this process and decide for certain, what each person's contributions should be and get agreement on that. In the off chance that the corresponding author doesn't discuss this with their co-authors and are just assigning their co-author contributions, we do send every co-author an email as soon as the corresponding author submits the manuscript. And that email contains information about the manuscript that was submitted, as well as the contributions that were assigned to that co-author by the corresponding author. And we ask the co-authors to contact the corresponding author if they disagree with the contributions that were assigned to them. So this way, any disagreements should be resolved before the manuscript is accepted and we don't run into problems late in the process that delay publication. So here you can see example author contribution statements before and after credit. And you can see, and this is as it appears in the PDF. Simon was showing how it appears in the HTML, which gives much more flexibility. But it is important that, the taxonomy or the author contribution methodology support both the PDF and the HTML versions of the article. And that's one way that CRediT is very nice, is it does work very well on both the PDF display of the article and in the HTML, XML versions of the article, which are focused on the underlying metadata and are machine readable. So in this case here on the left side, you can see before credit where things are listed by the type of contribution and then by the authors. So it's difficult to see what each author did because it's grouped by contribution instead. So when we were adopting CRediT, we decided to organize that differently so that it's organized by author. So there you can just quickly see, look at who the authors are and see what their contributions were. So you can quickly see that the first author there, had those, it's like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 contributions, whereas author towards the end, their only contribution was in the resources. So I think that makes it very clear what each of the authors contributed to the work. And then just to see as an example, I picked just a random article from our journals with a large number of authors to see, how authors had used the credit contributions for assignment to those authors. And as you can see here, the first author had 7 responsibilities that they did, from data curation, investigation, visualization, and then both writing the original draft and writing, reviewing, and editing. And the second and third authors, you can see, were also involved in writing both the original draft and review and editing, and also did some data curation, formal analysis, and visualization, but they apparently did not contribute to actually doing any experiments, which would have been investigation. And then the 2 corresponding or senior authors, you can see, were again involved in writing the original draft and reviewing and editing, and of course, project administration. And they, again, did not do any of the experiments, as you would expect, but they were the sole people who were classified as conceptualizing the work. So they determined what the project would be and how it would be run, and then involved in supervising it and acquiring funding for it. And then the vast majority of the authors, this is 31 authors, had only 1 to 3 contributions each. And you can see that only 2 of those contributions were involved in writing, whereas 13 of the contributions were involved in actually conducting the experiments, 10 were involved in providing resources, 7 in the analysis, 4 in various methodology capacities, and then 3 in visualization, 2 supervising, which is interesting, and then data curation. So this, you can see, then obviously touches on something Simon had mentioned, that traditionally, authorship is considered to be the writing of a manuscript. But in this case, you can very quickly see that the vast majority of the authors had essentially nothing to do with the writing of the manuscript. And instead, they were involved in actually conducting the research and contributing things that were necessary for doing that research. And this is where you get into a really gray area between what constitutes authorship versus what contributes, what would be just an acknowledgement in a paper. So oftentimes when people just supply resources for work, they're just acknowledged in the acknowledgements as providing those resources. But here you can see that, at least in this case, there were 10 people who provided resources, and some of them, all they did was provide resources, and yet they were considered authors. And this technically doesn't violate our authorship requirements as long as they reviewed the manuscript. And you can see that in terms of the definitions of the contributions, the writing is review and editing. So I think it's clear from this, hopefully, that the way authors are using the CRediT taxonomy is that if they review and edit it, they get credit for review and editing. But if all they're doing is reading the manuscript and approving it before submission, they're not being assigned credit for writing, review, and editing, which I think makes sense. So then, in conclusion, are we happy with CRediT? And here I can say resoundingly, yes, we are. I polled the journal staff, and they can't recall a single problem with contributions using the new system. And that was definitely not the case with the old system. We were constantly having to deal with disputes between authors in terms of what they had or hadn't done during the production process. And one journal managing editor actually called it the most seamless and effective process that we have at the journals. So I think, we're just very happy with the whole CRediT process and how it's implemented for us. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you. It's really very interesting how it was implemented because, for instance, comparing with our journals, we had only two categories of authors before CRediT Taxonomy, authors and non-authors, I would say. So that's it was quite interesting for us how it was developed, such a set of contributions. And to tell the truth, some of rules draw particular attention of editors, for instance, project administrations and funding acquisitions, if it's really equal contributions to the particular publication. Thank you very much. Then let me introduce Brian Cody, Chief of Scholastica. I confess I love Scholastica. We are using your platform very successfully, so I'm excited to have you here, and the floor is yours.
Great, thank you. What a wonderful intro. Let me share my screen. Here we go. All right, can you see these slides? Wonderful. So I'm going to talk about CRediT from a technical implementation side. I know, and there's a mix here because the technical implementation is both for developers who write code, but also for the journal staff to think about and communicate what they want and how they want it to operate. And so I'll try and talk about both those sides. And for context, for what I'm bringing, so I'm one of the co-founders of Scholastica. I'm also a programmer. And so I was heavily involved and interested in CRediT. I'll note sort of any standard that is in our industry, especially things coming out of NISO, I get very excited about because, our industry has a lot of legacy encoding of information. And when it's standardized, it generally reduces the cost of using that data down the road. And we do that. And so whenever there's some uniformity, I find it very useful. So we were excited to sort of follow CRediT and then, and I'll talk a bit about this, but then implement it. And to give a sense of the range of ways we're implementing this, so at Scholastica, we work with about 1,200 journals. That's across hundreds of publishers in STEM, humanities, social science, legal, and they have very wide-ranging different uses of CRediT, ORCID, ROAR. So there's sort of a wide range of how familiar their authors and editors are with different PIDs and different taxonomies. And so both implementing something but making it accessible to this wide range of journals was part of the challenge. So I'll talk about that. So first, we implement CRediT, and I'll sort of talk about this, but there's three services we offer, and so we use CRediT across these. So we have a peer review system, so from submission through review, revision, through acceptance or other final decision. And so we have CRediT at that stage. So when you're submitting the paper, we have a production system, so creating the XML, PDF, and then optionally the HTML. And so we implemented CRediT on that level as well. And our third piece is hosting open access journals. And so we also support CRediT there. So I'll talk about those three pieces. And so, we talked about this, and I want to thank both Simon and Daniel. Some of these slides I get to skip through, which is wonderful because you touched on these. But one of the pieces that resonates with me about CRediT is sort of acknowledging the contributions beyond the traditional author list. And sort of before I moved into Scholastica, I was in academia. I was doing doctoral work in sociology. And, I had that experience where you work on lots of projects in lots of different ways. But, you're not going to be the first author, and you might not be the second or third. And, the question becomes, how do you make that visible? And even the idea of putting it on your CV can be somewhat politically fraught because it's, well, does everyone agree that that contribution should be there? And I think CRediT does a lot, they talk about this idea of reducing author sort of conflict. I also think, that surfacing, especially for early career academics, their contribution can really make a difference throughout their career. So I was sort of personally excited about that. This was talked about, the 14 different roles, so I actually won't spend time on this. So as I mentioned, we were sort of following this, and in 2022, when CRediT became an accepted NISO standard, we sort of started putting this into our development queue, which I feel like everything takes longer than you want. And so this ended up being basically January 23 when we started working on it, and then got it finished later that year. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the technical considerations for CRediT, which do bubble up to the journal and to the author. And I just want to note, there are some metadata standards we talk about that really authors don't have to worry that much about. I'll give an example of the DOI. That's really often on the publisher, right? They both mint the DOI, and then they're putting the resolving URL. They're sort of handling that. The CRediT really does rely on that corresponding author and then the co-authors to both input and verify the information. And so it's an interesting challenge when you have to think both about metadata, which is often for machines, and the humans who are going to input it and work with it. So you have a user experience challenge throughout that. And I'll speak a little bit to that. So some of the technical logistics we talked about, there are multiple roles possible, and this was described, and I'm going to show pictures of how, what this looks like in our system. But again, this can be a little complicated when people are implementing this. So for example, I do know journals who are looking at adding CRediT within either their system, which could include things like, a form that they manage themselves, or a website the university hosts, something like that. And there's this idea in development of has and belongs to many. And so I'll talk about that, but it's a different kind of association than a straightforward single field. So for example, an author has an ORCID ID. So that's one object has this one field. And an ORCID ID belongs to the author. So it's a one-to-one. With CRediT, well, you can have many roles, but other authors can have that role too. And so when Daniel talked about the way they used to group their contribution roles, that's an example where you can think about when you put these data, you can group them different ways. So they used to display them by role with the authors listed, and then you can flip it and have the author and list out those roles. But it's just a little more of a sophisticated relationship, and so getting it right can also be tricky. The other piece here is the degree of contribution. And so, CRediT has these three categories of lead, equal, or supporting, and you'll see how we handled that. But we see a range of journals who really don't want to do that. They want to list the role, and that is the level they want to go to. We have publishers, sometimes in relationships with their funders, who really do want the fine-grained detail of that degree of contribution. And so when you add that in, you have both multiple roles someone can have and multiple levels. And then some publishers are more opinionated about what does it mean to be a lead or equal. If you have two people say they're lead and one person says equal, is that okay or not? And so we'll sort of talk about that, but there's some validations you can do and ways to think about that. And this was spoken about already, but the shared responsibility, sort of surfacing these. Again, I think CRediT's an interesting piece in that the metadata are meant to be, I think, seen and acknowledged, even the spirit of it, the idea of the contributions being more visible. Also means even though we might input them and they go to metadata, showing those in the article, and there are examples here of in the PDF, in the HTML, and of course in the XML is important. And this last note, I've sort of touched on this, but it's both machine readable, that's one of the sort of tenets of CRediT, but also it really, in our opinion, and I think when you look at CRediT, should be human readable, both for verification, but also to enhance the idea of acknowledging that contribution. So here's an example of what the interface looks like in one part of Scholastica. I think this is the peer review piece. So when you have an author, you can add their different roles. And in this particular implementation, you can say they also have degree of contribution. And that's required for this particular journal. Some journals that's optional. They on the right, they don't require that, or they don't even show it at all. So there's a range here. But you can add these, and I'll just sort of highlight some of the interfaces. We have a drop down so you can determine what their role is. You can then determine their contribution. So across here on the right, add more. As we saw, there were 14, so you can sort of keep adding. And then also be able to remove. And that piece we find is especially, useful as co-authors, for example, or checking things and saying, actually, that's wrong, or change this. But this interface we did, it's under the hood, capturing that metadata in standard that's going to be used for both the XML and then to be shown. So to talk about CRediT, the best practice from our standpoint is try and get this during submission. And again, and this was discussed a bit, different publishers want to require this at different stages. Some people really want to deal with this after acceptance, so during the production cycle. They don't really want to have to address this during peer review. Other publishers go the other way and require it on first submission. I think someone, maybe Daniel, mentioned requiring it on revision. So there's different points where people want to collect this. And I think, again, that's in our standpoint, it's always sort of up to the publisher. Generally, I think getting it earlier is better because, especially, for example, after acceptance, there's I think many people here will know, chasing authors of an accepted paper for all the additional information is less sort of a more difficult task than when they're initially submitting. And so this is an example of what the XML looks like. I think some people here might be familiar with JATS4R, and on the CRediT website, on the implementation page, they link to the JATS4R recommendations, but we found those really helpful. JATS as a standard, and when people is flexible, so actually things can be done many ways. I always love when there's a JATS4R, so JATS for reuse recommendation, because then we can say, well, let's do it this way, even though you could technically do it other ways. Let's really follow that example. So this is an example of someone who, I can't even count them, but might have something like 12 roles. That's in the XML. We do the affordance where it can be added or edited during the proofing phase. That's pretty common. And I'll sort of show where this ends up, both in the metadata and then in the view. So here's an example where on the left, this is what it might show up on as one journal is set up sort of in the way that Dano talked about, sort of organized by contribution level. And then people will go the other way and do it by author, what their specific contribution was. And I think I have an example. Like this would be an example looking at an author and HTML page where each author would then list their roles along with other metadata that might be connected. So things like their ORCID, their affiliations, etc. And so this both shows up, as I mentioned, in the XML and then any of the HTML and sort of the different places it might go, and then the PDF as well. I'll note, whenever we have a PDF, it usually has a landing, or it's going to have a landing page. So in the XML front matter, that's going to be there. I guess I just circled this. There we go. CRediT, once you start collecting it, it's something that can be used across the publishing lifecycle, especially, and this was mentioned, as it gets picked up in other, indexing services where it can continue to travel. So getting into things like ORCID eventually, as Simon mentioned, via Crossref. And that's one of the technical notes for us is thinking about future proofing. Collecting CRediT now can enable you, as some of these sources like Crossref are able to accept it, you can then deposit all those data. It makes the project less onerous if you already have the data, and then when they're ready, you send it all. And for example, Crossref, we're ready as soon as they accept it, send sort of thousands of articles, CRediT data up to them. There's a discussion about this on Crossref, which is great. And I'll stop here because I'm over time. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It was very interesting. Actually, I'm quite impressed by all the things were done. Am I right? We can use all this data in machine readable format, even for our internal needs. I mean, to collect data about how many supervisors we have and specialists in methodology. Great, that's great. Absolutely. Thank you so much. So, and actually, just a small remark. Degrees are amazing because actually, yes, sometimes we have 2 or 3 authors who claims on conceptualization, and one of them will be definitely the lead one, and the other one is with small portions of this pie, I would say. So, thank you very much. I would like to announce question and answers. And at the beginning, I would like to ask our colleagues I would like to launch the poll among our audience because it's very important for our speakers. Please choose your field of study. It helps to understand the audience needs and to continue our cooperation, because there are so many amazing things your announce will happen in future. So thank you very much. I'm social science. Oh, I can't vote. And let me announce one of the question in the chat. So that's this question is addressed to Simon. So Simon, if you can read it, please.
Sure, absolutely. So the question is, how did you, which wasn't me, so I'll explain that. How did we come up with the idea of unifying the distribution of roles between the co-authors? And is there a possibility of adding new roles? Well, I wasn't involved in it at the time. I really only came to CRediT in about 2016, I think. So Liz Allen, who you've seen, name has been bandied around in various slides. She was at the time working at Wellcome, at the Wellcome Trust, and was involved in organizing this workshop that was held at Harvard. There were about 20 people there from funders and publishers, basically discussing the problem that we've sort of outlined. And through that workshop, which I think was over 2 days, they sort of came up with and agreed these 14 roles. And that's basically how it happened. There was a validation process, and I think there might have been some slight tweaking over the following months. Is there a possibility of adding new roles? Yes, there is a possibility, because a standard is always evolving. We have an annual review cycle. So far, we have been resistant to adding new roles, because any new role that people have suggested so far has actually just been with a little bit of vocabulary change incorporated or mapped to one of the existing roles. I think if we were going to add additional roles, it's possible that it might be a proliferation, and the next step might even be to take the film credit approach, where at the end of a film you see like the 100 people involved, including the key grip and the stuntman and whatever, and actually that might be the way to go. On the other hand, then the credit attribution list might be longer than the paper itself, so there is that kind of balance of how much information you want and whether it's useful. So yes, there is a possibility, but we are relatively happy at the moment. But certainly there are some different words which need using, particularly in the arts and humanities area. Sorry, long answer.
No, don't worry. It's absolutely fine. Another question about funding acquisition and project administration. I think this question can go to Daniel, because on some of your slides there were too many authors with a lot of different roles. So is it allowed to be, for instance, a contributor but not writing the text?
Yes, you can be.
I was involved only in project administration, so I'm also an author. No?
Yeah, well, because the reality, at least in the biological sciences, health sciences, the person which is acquiring the funding is the person almost by definition running the project. I think there's almost never that's not the case. And then in terms of project administration, yeah, oftentimes that's the same person again, but you will have some large labs where the person who technically runs the lab or oversees the lab and acquires all the funding actually has so many other responsibilities that they don't do day-to-day project administration of what's going on in their lab. So they'll actually have lab managers who oversee the projects in the lab and make sure everybody's doing what they need to be doing and such. So, and that is a very administrative function, but very important for making sure that the project is successful and does come to fruition. So, yeah, it's hard to say how often those people do get acknowledged as authors in manuscripts and how often they don't, if that's all they're doing. So then that's one thing that would be interesting to investigate down the road, especially now that we've published so many manuscripts where people have been classed by this, is to actually go and start surveying people who have chosen that role and see, what just really how people are interpreting these roles, how they're using them, and why they consider this person eligible for authorship based on providing these contributions. I think that would be something really interesting to do now that we have so much data that we can actually do those surveys and studies.
Especially with help of different machine algorithms and so on. Absolutely agree with you. We have so many specific fields of disciplines everywhere. It was amazing how the authors deal with this taxonomy, because I'm social sciences, and it sounds very controversial for me, something like project administration, like really an authorship in the article. I believe that the next hour question perhaps goes to Brian, because it's about would it be possible to collect EDI data using CRediT in the future?
Yeah, I mean, I almost defer to others about, so in our world, I think the idea of mapping, so the idea of, I'm assuming EDI, like D&I, so equity, diversity, inclusion, not, sort of the business exchange acronym, is that it's data about the author, and there's usually a different level of transparency and sharing of those data versus, for example, the author role. But I know it's something that we have at least one publisher who's been sort of wondering if we can get credit data into ORCID, and if ORCID supported EDI, then you would have this nice mapping, or you could crosswalk. I do know publishers use those data internally for reporting. I mean, I asked someone on the committee, but my guess would be that that in terms of adding that to the taxonomy as a canonical field, that's probably not in the cards. I don't know if Simon, you want to speak to that?
Yeah, I mean, I was going to say, it comes back to that thing you talked about before about that sort of one-to-one mapping. It would be more useful for that probably to be associated with the ORCID record, but also there are lots of data protection issues there as well.
Certainly, I would prefer to have in my ORCID record an exact contributions in all these publications, because even now we have more and more teams authors in all our authors. It's so popular right now. let me kindly thank all of our speakers for your time and for sharing your experience with us for this excellent presentations. I hope you will allow us to share it with our audience and with this recording. Thank you so much. And let's keep in touch. We would be happy to contribute to further development of taxonomy if it's possible for some extent or for some limit. Thank you very much, Mary, for helping.
Thank you very much for having us. Iryna, did you see the note from Mary about EASE will soon be taking up providing support for CRediT?
Yes, certainly we will translate it. It was sent to Mary directly. I'm sorry, but we will do that, and we are going to work on further guidance and recommendation for our editors how to use taxonomy here in Ukraine to translate some. We will thorough read all your presentations with so many cool things about taxonomy. And we will work on some guidance and brief rules how to use it properly. Yeah. So thank you.
All right, thank you. Have a good one.
Thanks, everyone.